and for Mr. and Mrs. Middleton, the grandest ride to Buckingham Palace they will ever experience, as they travelled in the Australian state coach with Prince Charles and the Duchess of Cornwall. Next came one of the great set pieces of any royal wedding: the appearance of the newlyweds and the rest of the royal family on the palace balcony. But before that could happen, everything and everyone had to be in place. The pomp and circumstance of a royal wedding is steeped in hundreds of years of tradition. And what a spectacle for the crowds. Martin Brunt, Sky News crime correspondent, was watching.
For the capital's police, keeping the peace around the royal wedding was one of the biggest challenges they had faced for many years. Security, crowd control and safety. They were all issues full of potential difficulties that could have spoiled the big day. There were 1 million people on the street and a global live TV audience of 2 billion. The Metropolitan Police could not afford to get it wrong. From its nearby headquarters at New Scotland Yard, the force had been planning its operation for many weeks. In the end, 5,000 police officers, joined by military personnel, ensured that the pomp and ceremony went uninterrupted. Perhaps the biggest challenge came after the service, moving thousands of revellers towards Buckingham Palace. Nobody wanted to miss the royal balcony appearance.
In a well-rehearsed and highly disciplined operation, hundreds of police formed a human chain to shepherd tens of thousands of well-wishers as close to the palace as possible.
For those who couldn't get close to the route of the wedding procession, giant screens were erected in Hyde Park. They ensured that nobody missed a moment of the celebrations. The police commissioner, Sir Paul Stevenson, had told his officers that morning they should appreciate the honour of being involved. And how they did. They could enjoy their role as the traditional, friendly bobby on the street, an increasingly rare opportunity in the modern world.
Before long, the Mall became a sea of Union flags as the huge crowds moved slowly forward.
At the Victoria Memorial, 500,000 people were marshalled gently into place.
Everyone was hoping they would get right up to the palace gates for the big moment.
The officer in charge of this unprecedented operation said, with some obvious relief, that it had been an amazing success. And who would argue with that? It was a captivated audience. A vast army of Middle England royalists, young and old. There were Londoners, away-day travellers, and overseas visitors.
At 1:25, the curtains behind those famous balcony doors began to twitch. The lucky few who'd made it all the way to the railings primed their cameras. And then, right on cue, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge stepped onto the balcony. "Wow," said Catherine. And William, too, though used to great royal occasions such as this, seemed taken aback at the sheer volume of the crowds. Awesome, he seemed to say. The Queen led the rest of the family out. Slowly they all found their place. For Carol and Michael Middleton, this surely must have been the moment when the reality of the extraordinary transition their daughter had now made hit home. Something approaching 1 million people were cheering their girl. She was their princess, their duchess, their future queen. And by rights, Mr. and Mrs. Middleton would now be expected to curtsy to their own daughter. Catherine herself looked supremely happy and thoroughly at home with her new in-laws. She was proving time and again that she's a mature young woman who's entered into a unique lifestyle with her eyes wide open. All of this was fascinating for the crowds, but everyone knew what they were really waiting for: the couple's first public kiss. The roar of approval seemed to stretch all the way back to Admiralty Arch. For one little bridesmaid, though, Grace Van Curtsum, it all seemed a bit much. She put her hands over her ears and scowled. Prince Charles was taking a grandfatherly interest in his wife's little granddaughter, Eliza. William, it seemed, had rather enjoyed the effect his kiss had had on the crowds. He knew they wanted more. One more? He asked his wife. This time he lingered longer. The crowds went into a frenzy. There was one last spectacle, a wedding tribute from the Battle of Britain memorial flight. Over London's skyline thundered a Lancaster, flanked by a Spitfire and a Hurricane, great symbols of British resistance during the war years. And an even deeper roar when they were followed, precisely 30 seconds later, by two state-of-the-art typhoons and two tornadoes, blasting overhead in box formation. It was the Queen who decided it was time for the wedding celebrations to move back into the privacy of the palace. 650 guests were waiting for the reception to get fully underway. The Queen's chefs had prepared 10,000 canapes, and there was plenty of champagne to be enjoyed. As her husband led her back through the palace doors, Catherine couldn't resist one last look over her shoulder. A very special memory of a very special wedding day. For the crowds around the palace and along the wedding route, the party had already lasted many hours. But all over the country, other street parties were just getting going. Thousands were held in towns and villages up and down the land. And of course, this was an extra bank holiday, with Easter creating 2 four-day weekends in a row. The country was in the mood for fun. The parties gave children a special memory to take with them into later life. A memory of the time everyone joined together to mark a new milestone in the history of an ancient monarchy. It had been announced that William and Catherine would be heading back to Clarence House for a rest before the evening celebrations, but no one expected them to make the short journey in quite the style they did. Would it be a Rolls-Royce? Or a Bentley? Or the State Landau again? No. This was going to be a modern end to a traditional wedding celebration. The crowd peered. An engine started. Was that really the future monarch driving his father's old blue convertible? An Aston Martin given to Prince Charles on his 21st birthday? In the passenger seat, Catherine, still wearing the gown in which she had made her vows a few hours earlier, clearly thought it was hilarious. As the car rolled out of the gates of the palace, astonishment quickly turned to cheers. They drove slowly, giving the crowds as close a view as possible. And they both looked delighted when, overhead, a bright yellow Sea King helicopter made a surprise fly past. a wedding tribute to the search and rescue pilot Prince. The number plate bore all the hallmarks of a plan dreamt up by best man Prince Harry, along with the L plate and the balloons.
Jenny, the biggest surprise of the day, must have given the police an extra headache. But despite the security concerns, it was possible for a royal heir and his bride to drive themselves between two palaces. Of course, there were protection officers in a vehicle behind them, but this was a remarkable, fun scene in a country that's had its security problems in the past.
William was enjoying being behind the wheel, motoring sedately down towards Stableyard Road. And then, as quickly as the moment had begun, it ended. The car disappeared through the gates of Clarence House. The Dude and the Duchess, as Prince Harry later dubbed them, were gone. A day that had started with so much expectation from the crowds and the country was almost over. But what a day it had been. From fairy tale dresses to balcony kisses, trees in the Abbey to balloons on the car. This had been a remarkable royal wedding, and one that neither they nor we will ever forget.
This was the moment they'd all
Been waiting for.
the kiss that said it all. Prince William and his bride, the new Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, sent the crowds into a frenzy as they sealed their marriage with a very public show of love. 1 million people had converged on Buckingham Palace to share their happiness. 2 billion people were watching around the world. It was a day that brought a smile to everyone's face. Outside Westminster Abbey, the crowds had begun to gather from early morning. Some hardy souls had spent the past 3 nights camping out to ensure they had the best possible view.
I've been to their wedding, the Queen, when she was a youngster. I've followed up with Princess Diana, Margaret, and I'm here today for William. I believe in the royal family.
Oh, I'm here just to experience the whole thing, to see the pomp and the circumstance, and, you know, just to be here and get the feeling of the crowd and the excitement. I love it.
Everyone wanted a ringside seat as Prince William finally tied the knot with Catherine Middleton, the girl he'd met and fallen in love with almost 10 years earlier. A mile or so away, in a luxury suite at the Goring Hotel, the bride and her family were getting ready. Around the corner at Buckingham Palace, the rather grey early morning revealed a quiet calm. But behind the palace walls, the well-oiled machinery of an occasion such as this was already in action. Outside the palace and down the Mall, the crowds who'd spent the night in makeshift tents were beginning to stir. The mood was one of growing excitement at the prospect of the pageantry and partying that was to follow. The doommongers who had predicted that no one would care about the royal wedding were about to be proved comprehensively wrong. At the Abbey, everything was now in place. At William and Catherine's request, 8 imposing trees, maples and hornbeams, had been brought in from the royal estates to mark their route up the aisle. In the splendour of this 1,000-year-old royal peculiar, as it's known, meaning that it's neither a cathedral nor a parish church, 38 sovereigns have been crowned, including, of course, our present Queen. And this was to be the 16th royal wedding to be held at Westminster Abbey. The Queen herself was married here, as was her mother and her sister Margaret. By 9 o'clock, the first of the 1,900 guests had begun to arrive. With roads around the whole area sealed off, they'd been asked to allow plenty of time to get to the Abbey. And this was certainly an occasion that no one wanted to miss. All of them felt privileged to be there to witness a moment in history, the marriage of our future king to a girl who'll one day be Queen Consort. The ushers would have their work cut out, seating 1,000 family and friends of the bride and groom, 50 members of the British royal family, 40 foreign royals, 60 governors-general and prime ministers from around the world, and some 200 diplomats and government officials. 80 representatives from Prince William's charities were also amongst those invited to the society event of the decade. And of course, the fashion stakes were high. Everyone had put in a huge amount of effort, some with more success than others. The fashion expert James Sherwood was among those who cast a critical eye over the results.
The press were sometimes less than kind, but I actually think the occasion was incredibly well dressed. As far as British millinery is concerned, I think the royal wedding has demonstrated that the hat is, if not making a comeback, it's certainly triumphant. And actually what we did see in Westminster Abbey were hats that take a lot of, I don't know, it takes a lot of poise to wear these hats, and it takes a lot of commitment. You know, when one looks at the Queen, formal day dress is the Queen's working wardrobe, but for 90% of the women in the Abbey, this was an exception to a rule, and something that they really had to rise to the occasion, and they certainly did. It's rather nice for me to see an occasion like the royal wedding where the uniforms are perfect, the mourning tales are perfect, and the ladies have made a terrific effort. We read from the invitation that it was mourning tales, lounge suits and uniforms were all acceptable, but it's rather nice to see that the chaps came down in favour of uniform and mourning tales. And also, you know, we see a lot of RAF uniform because Prince William's currently serving with the RAF in emergency search and rescue. I think what stood out for me at the royal wedding, that it was just lovely to see well-dressed people who know exactly what they're doing, they know how to behave, they're dressed in their best. And you can see waving the Dowager Duchess of Devonshire, Deborah Mitford, the last of the Mitford sisters, with her daughter-in-law, the present Duchess of Devonshire. I always love to see the dowagers because they're almost like galleons sailing forth in the Abbey. It's heaven